this is a snapshot of the half-day course that I run on the same subject. So you're not going to get the full detail of what I deliver, but hopefully it will give you a bit of a push in terms of the kind of things that I cover. So just a little bit about me briefly before we get going. So I have a 17-year career with Royal Mail, working very closely with the Communication Workers Union as well. That was primarily in HR, both sort of frontline operational roles and management back office roles. So I spent 17 years. I left there last year. And since then, I've done various pieces of work with HSBC, Cadent, TSB, AstraZeneca, as well as a load of other customers as well. I am a CMC registered workplace mediator. I'm also a mental health first aid instructor member and a Chartered Management Institute fellow. In terms of the mental health positioning, I do a lot of work around mental health because I've had my own struggles with mental health as well. And anybody that's heard me speak before or hears me speak on a sort of semi-regular basis will know that I talk about mental health and I break down the barriers of stigma purely because if I can help one person in terms of their everyday life managing mental health, then it's made my struggles more worthwhile. So it's something I'm hugely passionate about. I'm obviously a member of the Mediator Network and I am one of the sponsors this week for IMOW. Very, very proud to be one of the sponsors. And in case anybody's been living under a rock and not seen on LinkedIn recently, I was recently awarded Workplace Mediation Award Winner of the Year as well. So I've got quite a lot of experience in terms of the workplace mediation field. So before we get on to understanding the link between conflict, mental health, and then where mediation comes in, the first thing to understand is what do we mean by mental health? So I've used the word World Health Organization's definition in that it's a state of well-being in which every individual realizes his or her potential, can cope with normal stresses of life and can work productively, fruitfully, and be able to make a contribution to his or her community. And there's some key phrases there. It's about realizing potential, being able to deal with the normal stresses of life, and that productivity and fruitfully able to make a contribution. So they're the key points to remember in terms of mental health. But we all have mental health, whether we are well in terms of our mental health or poorly in terms of our mental health, obviously depends on the individual. But to bear in mind that when we talk about mental health, this is something everybody has, the same as physical health. So what I'd like you to do, although I can't see the chat at the moment, what I'd like you to do now, I'm going to ask some questions and I'd just like you to answer in the chat whether you think these are true or false. I'm going to stop sharing for a second. So the very first question, stress, anxiety and depression, and this is in the UK as well, so I'm aware that we've got some international people on here. So in the UK, stress, anxiety and depression are the third biggest cause of sick absence in our society. Is that true or false? Just give a minute. That is actually false. It's actually much higher. It's the biggest cause of sick absence in our society. It's not the third biggest, it is the biggest cause. Next question. Mental ill health costs UK employers an estimated 33 to 42 billion a year. Yeah, that's true. It is as high as that. It is in the billions. Suicide is the leading cause of death for men under 50 in the UK. Yeah, I'm sorry to say that one is true, unfortunately. One of the reasons why I try and break down the stigma is partly as well because of the men in society that don't feel able to talk, and that's one of the reasons why male suicide is so high. The other reason is because they tend to choose more violent means in order to complete suicide, so it's more like they're more likely to succeed. And the last one, 40% of people with a diagnosable mental illness receive no treatment at all. Oh, a real mixture of true and false for this one. It's actually false. It's 75% of people with a diagnosable mental illness receive no treatment. The key to remember is people aren't necessarily accessing the services they need. So they may have a diagnosable illness, but because they're not accessing the service, we don't actually know whether they have that illness or not. So that was just a little bit of a true and a false. So just to give you a few more figures, and as I say, these are based on the UK again. In terms of the detail that you've got in front of you, 3.6 billion is purely sick absence. That's how much it costs the UK economy in terms of sick absence. 3.1 billion is the cost of replacing staff who leave their jobs due to mental ill health each year. And presenteeism, which is people coming to work but being less productive than usual. So they're at work, but they're not really at work. Presenteeism costs the UK economy 21.2 billion each year. And they are frightening statistics. And a lot of the reason why people in the UK go off sick or aren't particularly present at work because of mental health, a lot of that can be caused by conflict. So it could be conflict with their line manager, it could be conflict with somebody that they work with. There could be any number of reasons. I know when I worked for Royal Mail, one of the highest figures for their sick absence was stress, and a lot of the time it was work-related stress. So in terms of what is conflict, conflict is inevitable. Conflict is always going to happen. If there are any mediators watching this at the moment, you know, it's our bread and butter. The difference in conflict, though, is whether it is destructive or constructive. So it's inevitable, but it doesn't always have to be a bad thing. It could be a driver of change. It could be a driver of discussion. There could be so many reasons why it can be construed as constructive, but so often we see it, especially as mediators, we see it as destructive. And in terms of conflict, it is generally caused by any one of these 5 things. So a difference in values, particularly a difference in needs. So somebody may have a real need for being heard. If they're not being heard, or if they're not being listened to, then that generates conflict. It could be communication style or management style. It could be differing perceptions. So one of the biggest things I see in mediation, the reason why people are in mediation is because they have different perceptions of the same event. So it doesn't necessarily mean that either one is right or wrong. They're just viewing that event slightly differently from each other. There could be differing goals. So what people want out of life in general, what people want out of their work life. But each one of those can be the cause of conflict. So another question for the chat. And I need you to keep an eye on this one for me, Sarah, because I can't show the picture and look in the chat at the same time.
Okay.
So what does everybody see on screen in front of them now?
So we've got fries, mayo, jam, egg ketchup and French fries, egg chips and jam, fried egg chips, jam, egg chips and red stuff.
I absolutely love showing this photo, because would it surprise you all to know that that is actually fruit, yogurt and apple? So what you're looking at here is apple chips yogurt with an apricot on the top, or it might be a peach actually on the top, and then some jam. But this is what I mean about differing perceptions. So I know that that's fruit and jam, but everybody else, your brain has automatically seen it as egg and chips. And I think I'd much prefer egg and chips, if I'm absolutely honest. So people's perceptions and conflict can be driven by their frame of reference. And what we're talking about when we talk about frame of reference is, what are people's values? So what are your personal values? Are they in conflict with the people that are around you? In terms of illness and disability, obviously mental ill health is an illness, and it can be classed as a disability as well. So if somebody is struggling with mental health conditions, in mediation, that can very much affect their perception of events. It can very much affect how they act in mediation. It can be really, really difficult in terms of whether they can whether you can inspire empathy in them or not, because some mental health conditions actually are a barrier to empathy. I mentioned already about goals and aspirations. You know, that's what frames us, that's what makes us who we are. Our educational background, whether you went to university, whether you went to school and stayed at school, whether you've got qualifications. Your age is a really, really big thing when we talk about frame of reference, because as you saw earlier on, I mentioned that 50 and below, men aged up to 50 are the highest suicide rates. But actually we're seeing a rise now in those over 65, particularly in lockdown, attempting suicide as well. So age can be a really big precursor for mental health conditions and mental health concerns. Your cultural influences, and these are all things that are relevant to the conflict conversation as much as they're relevant to the mental health conversation. You know, frame of reference is all about who we are. So it very much drives how we are in everyday life, regardless of what relationships we have. So our cultural influences. So what could be seen as good language in one particular culture could be very different in another. Trauma, my mental health conditions have come from childhood trauma. So it's something I've lived with since I was a child. So it's something that has framed my entire life since it happened. And that can be quite difficult at times. You've got somebody that's had that, because if they've lived with that trauma from such a young age, when they come into conflict, they may react completely irrationally in terms of somebody that hasn't had that trauma. But for them, the way they're reacting is how they keep themselves safe. So it's important to recognize how frame of reference can change how people deal with conflict. What their family and relationships are like, their general background and upbringing, and obviously work as well. These are all things that make us who we are. So I show this a lot. It's used a lot in HR circles in the UK, particularly in terms of change, but I like to use it in terms of conflict. And what this does, as conflict progresses over a length of time, that has an impact on our well-being in general, regardless of whether you have a mental health condition or not. It affects your well-being. So when something happens, when an incident happens, we are initially in shock, denial, and frustration. So if you've fallen out with a colleague at work or a family member, there's always like, oh, I can't believe they spoke to me like that. And I'm sure they didn't mean it like that. And then there's that element of frustration of, well, I'm not quite sure why it happened, and the frustration trying to make sense of what's happened. If it's a big enough incident, or if it's with somebody that you have regular conflict with, you can then sink into a depression stage. And that doesn't necessarily mean the medical explanation for depression. It could just be you feel a bit low, you don't want to come to work, you may be starting to exhibit signs of stress. If you're somebody with a pre-existing mental health condition, you could really sink into depression at this point. And then through mediation or through time, whichever is available, we can then move into the acceptance stage. But in terms of mediation, that dotted line there, this is where we can come in with mediation, because what we can do is we can ease people out of that depression stage, or make it so that they don't sink as far into it in the first place. And obviously for people with pre-existing conditions, that's a major thing. That could keep somebody at work, it could keep somebody in that job, it could keep somebody sort of in a position where they are well. So I've just got a couple more slides to show, and then I'm more than happy to open up to a Q&A. So as mediators or coaches or line managers or whoever it is that is faced with this particular situation, the role isn't to diagnose. Don't deny access to mediation without a proper discussion. So just because somebody struggles with depression and anxiety, it doesn't automatically mean they can't take part. It's about having the conversation with them. And don't assume by suffering from a mental illness, this affects how they can engage in mediation. But what we can do, we can make reasonable adjustments. So reasonable adjustments might simply be just starting an hour later. It might be having more breaks. It might be doing more in written form rather than necessarily a lot of talking. It's whatever they need to get through the process. Do take the time to assess and evaluate the ability of the parties to engage meaningfully. So if you do have any concerns, take that time in a breakout room to have the conversation with them around, are they still able to engage meaningfully? And do remember, we have a responsibility to share where someone states they wish to self-harm or harm others. Now, when I do confidentiality, when I do agreements to mediate rather, which talk about confidentiality, there are 3 reasons why confidentiality would be breached. And one of them is where you are concerned for somebody's well-being. So this is all about supporting the parties in the room, but the key as well is also to look after yourself, because I would say more than 95% of the mediations I have ever done have involved some form of mental health condition, whether it be as low level as stress or as severe as suicidal ideation, and I've had both. And it can be draining when you're seeing this over and over again in the mediation room. So as much as breaks are there for the parties, take breaks for yourself as well, so that you can be in the best position to support those people. Research and get advice before and during the process. And find your coping mechanism. Find a way to let off steam. So it's very much about understanding how you're doing. So it's back to that self-awareness piece. So one of my coping mechanisms is I go and lift weights down the gym. It makes me feel, if I feel physically strong, it does help my mental strength as well. Debriefing. So like I said earlier on about having buddies, if you don't know in advance that you're going to have this type of mediation, or even just a difficult mediation, it doesn't even need to be something that's mental health related, I cannot overemphasize how useful debriefing is with somebody. Reflective log. So take time to sit and reflect on what's happened, what worked well, what didn't work so well, what you could do differently next time. And don't ever be afraid to ask for help. The whole point of supporting somebody through a mental health condition is encouraging them to ask for help. Well, we need to do the same as mediators as well.